14 years ago, a young college student in Daytona Beach finished her night shift and never made it home. Her car disappeared with her, leaving only a silent road and a mother's endless search. Police suspected an abduction, but with no body and no clues, the case went cold. Yet through all those years, one grieving mother never gave up keeping a porch light burning, hoping her daughter would walk back through the door. And then, one overlooked piece of evidence suddenly revealed a truth no one could have imagined, exposing a neighbor no one ever suspected. Before we dive into this shocking case, let us know where you're watching from. And if you want to uncover more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe.
16 years ago, the city of Daytona Beach, Florida, carried on like any other seaside town. Waves crashing against the shore, neon lights glowing over the coastal highway. But for the Morgan family, that night would mark the beginning of a nightmare that never seemed to end. Rachel Morgan, a 20-year-old college freshman and waitress at the small harbor cafe, vanished without a trace on her short drive home after work. Her car disappeared with her, and though investigators suspected an abduction, the case quickly stalled when no body, no vehicle, and almost no leads surfaced. What remained was silence, heavy and unbearable. Her mother, Patricia, refused to surrender to that silence. Every night she left the porch light burning, a fragile beacon of hope that Rachel might walk through the front door again. Years passed. Grief pressed down like an endless tide, and yet she never stopped waiting. Unknown to her, a tiny, overlooked clue was sitting in the evidence locker, a detail that would one day, thanks to advances in DNA technology, shatter the fragile illusion of hope and reveal the horrifying truth that had been hidden all along. On September 14, 2009, Rachel had finished her late shift. The harbor cafe smelled of roasted coffee and fried food, its old jukebox still humming faintly as she tied back her long hair. Exhaustion in her eyes, but a small spark of youth still shining through. At around 10:30 that night, she called her mother, promising she would be home within 15 minutes. That call, simple and ordinary, became the last time Patricia ever heard her daughter's voice. Rachel drove her Toyota Corolla down a quiet road shaded by palms, the dim streetlights casting uneven pools of yellow across the asphalt. Cypress Creek's wooden bridge creaked in the warm night air as the salty ocean breeze drifted inland. By 11 o'clock, when Patricia glanced at the clock and her daughter had still not arrived, unease settled in her chest. By midnight, unanswered calls turned into dread, and by dawn, dread became terror. A jogger stumbled upon a purse near Cypress Creek, Rachel's ID and personal belongings scattered inside, but the young woman herself was gone. Police sealed off the area. Yellow tape cut across the still road as K9 units searched the overgrown reeds, their handlers' voices blending with the rustle of wild grass. Investigators peered into the water and combed the roadside for anything out of place. What had started as a routine evening was now the stage for a chilling mystery. The town that once thrived on beach tourism and neon nightlife found itself consumed by fear, every conversation orbiting the same question: what happened to Rachel Morgan? By morning, the search had swelled into one of the largest the county had ever seen. Patrol cars lined the canal, their red and blue lights reflecting off the surface of Cypress Creek like distorted stars. Volunteers from across Volusia County and beyond poured in, men and women wearing reflective vests, clutching flashlights, trudging through mud and marsh. Some walked the shoreline in slow, deliberate lines, scanning the sand for a shoe, a scarf, a scrap of fabric that might provide an answer. Police even deployed boats with sonar, hoping to find Rachel's Corolla beneath the water's dark surface, but only broken bicycles and soggy debris emerged. The car had vanished as completely as its driver. Then a spark of possibility lit up: the gloom. A witness recalled seeing a dark green pickup truck circling near the harbor cafe around the time Rachel left work. The details splashed across local newscasts that evening, igniting a flood of tips, rumors, and speculation. Yet no one could pin down the mysterious truck or its driver. As days turned into weeks, Rachel's face appeared everywhere: on television, screens, in newspapers, plastered on posters taped to gas stations and grocery store windows. Headlines screamed, "20-year-old girl mysteriously missing," and what had begun as a family's desperate plea transformed into a story that shook an entire community to its core. Patricia refused to leave the search sites, her eyes hollowed by sleepless nights, clinging to the faintest hope that someone would suddenly cry out. They'd found her daughter. But as the days dragged into weeks, Daytona Beach sank into a heavy silence. The Corolla, the missing piece everyone believed could unlock the mystery, remained gone without a trace. 3 months later, the rhythm of the city returned as if nothing had happened. Tourists once again crowded the beachfront. Neon signs flickered to life each evening, and waves rolled endlessly against the sand. Yet inside the Morgan household, time stood still. Patricia kept her ritual alive. Every dusk she lit the porch lamp, its warm glow spilling across the empty street, a signal to Rachel, a prayer disguised as light. What began as a message to a missing daughter became a symbol that haunted the neighborhood, a reminder of the young woman who had vanished. Police, after dozens of press conferences, quietly admitted what the family already feared. They had no evidence of a crime. The Toyota Corolla had vanished as completely as Rachel herself. The dark green pickup remained a ghost in the investigation, and no suspect stood out. At first, officers promised the case was fresh, every lead being chased, but weeks of silence dulled those reassurances, like a blade gone dull. Patricia sat surrounded by fading posters of her daughter, trapped in a maze with no exit, her grief feeding the uncertainty that spread through the community. The town itself fractured under the weight of speculation. In diners, barber shops, and Sunday church halls, conversations circled the same question. Was Rachel alive? Some argued she had been ambushed, pointing to other Florida cases where women were snatched under cover of darkness. Others whispered that maybe she had run away with a secret boyfriend or fled financial pressures, theories that stung Patricia like salt on an open wound. She knew her daughter's heart. Rachel loved her family, her studies, and her life too, much to vanish willingly. Yet Patricia also understood that when answers never come, people create their own, no matter how cruel. Each night she sat on the porch swing beneath the unwavering light, staring at the dark road. Neighbors passed by with quiet nods, often avoiding words, sometimes even avoiding the street altogether, unable to face the raw anguish etched on Patricia's face. For some, the porch lamp had become less a beacon of hope and more a haunting reminder of a life cut short. Police kept the case open but thinned their efforts, privately admitting that beyond a few scattered details, there was nothing to go on. Rachel's car left no skid marks, no glass, no trace of oil, vanished as though it had never driven those roads. Inside the Morgan home, the silence carved deeper wounds. Michael, Rachel's father, forced himself to the auto shop each day, often retreating to the restroom to weep alone, hiding his grief from Patricia. Their 15-year-old son, Ethan, shrank into himself, moving like a ghost through the house, refusing to speak of his sister. Family dinners grew heavy, filled only with the clink of silverware and unspoken sorrow. Daytona Beach, once vibrant, now carried a scar no one dared to touch. Some clung to hope, others quietly accepted the worst, but everyone shared the same torment, not knowing. As frustration mounted, investigators disclosed a small piece of evidence they had held close, a blurry clip from an ATM security camera less than 300 feet from the Harbor Cafe. The grainy footage showed headlights cutting briefly through the dark at around 10:20 that night, the exact time Rachel had left work. The vehicle appeared only for a moment, its features indistinguishable, but its shape matched the description of a dark green pickup. For detectives, it was the closest thing to a thread in a case built on shadows. For Patricia, it was another tormenting almost, a ghostly fragment that only deepened the mystery. Alongside the grainy ATM footage, another discovery briefly stirred hope before it too was cast aside. A woman's jacket found near the banks of Cypress Creek, less than 200 yards from where Rachel's purse had been recovered. Mud-stained and soaked, the jacket looked as though it had been dragged or discarded in a struggle. But in 2009, local DNA testing was costly and limited, and with no direct evidence linking it to Rachel, investigators photographed it, filed it, and stored it away. What seemed minor at the time would later stand as one of the investigation's most painful oversights. When word of the jacket and the ATM clip leaked, Daytona Beach erupted. One side of the community accused police of incompetence, furious that a potential clue had been ignored, What if that jacket carried Rachel's DNA, or worse, her abductor's? The other side argued the department had done the best it could within the limits of budget and technology. But no matter who was right, the truth was the same. The case was going nowhere. Patricia learned of the jacket not from detectives, but from a neighbor who worked at the sheriff's office. She sat frozen for hours, imagining her daughter dragged through the mud by Cypress Creek, that jacket the last sign of a violent struggle. It horrified her, yet it sparked a desperate ember of hope. Maybe hidden inside that fabric was the answer. Again and again she demanded police test it, but was met with deflections about cost, priorities, and resources. To her, the jacket was a cry for justice. To them, it was a footnote. Meanwhile, the ATM footage became a topic of Sunday prayers and gossip alike. People claimed to have seen a green pickup circling the Harbor Cafe weeks before Rachel vanished. A mechanic swore he had once repaired a similar truck for a stranger. A woman recalled seeing one parked by the beach. Each account was flimsy, fragmented, impossible to stitch into certainty. 3 months after Rachel's disappearance, these faint threads became fuel for speculation. Some were convinced she had been forced into that truck and driven far away. Others insisted the jacket marked the spot where her life was cut short. But in the end, the theories remained just that. Theories. The Toyota Corolla never appeared. The pickup remained a shadow, and the puzzle lay scattered with too many missing pieces. For the police, these scraps of evidence were filed away, gathering dust. For the community, they became the bitter reminder of a chance missed. And for Patricia, they were wounds that refused to close. Passing the sheriff's office, she could only think of that jacket, locked in storage, silenced before it had the chance to speak. By 2012, 3 long years after the night Rachel disappeared, the Volusia County Sheriff's Office made the decision no family ever wants to hear. Rachel Morgan's disappearance was officially classified as a cold case. The sterile phrase, typed into legal documents, felt like a knife twisting in Patricia's chest. To her, it wasn't just bureaucracy. It was a declaration that her daughter no longer mattered. The officers who had once promised they would never stop searching quietly moved on to new files, leaving Rachel's case to sit on a shelf, tended only by clerks tasked with occasional updates. Yet while the system closed the book, the Morgans never did. Each September 14th, they gathered on Daytona Beach, the place Rachel once loved to jog at sunrise and sit to watch the horizon swallow the sun. Family, neighbors, and a handful of classmates came with candles, white carnations, and worn photographs. Together they stood in a circle, releasing flowers into the waves, each blossom a prayer carried out to sea. Flickering candlelight reflected on Patricia's worn face, on Michael's quiet grief, and on Ethan, now a teenager, still haunted by his sister's absence. At first, local news cameras covered these vigils, but over time, interest waned. Headlines shifted to new crimes, new storms, new scandals. Rachel's name slipped from the front pages, resurfacing only in the occasional Unsolved Mysteries segment. For Patricia, the silence was crushing. Passing newsstands, she saw glossy covers filled with strangers' faces and thought, "My daughter has been forgotten by the world." Yet in the Morgan household she was everywhere. Her photos hung in every room, on the mantel, in the hallway, even by Patricia's bedside. Michael, quiet and steady, refused to sell the family's other Corolla, as though keeping the car alive preserved some small piece of Rachel. And so the porch light continued to burn, night after night, its glow a fragile shield against the darkness of forgetting. Ethan, once too frightened to speak of his sister, found his voice in quiet solitude, scribbling poems and notes in a journal, small letters to Rachel that he knew she'd never read. Patricia, meanwhile, kept Rachel's presence alive at vigils by reading passages from her daughter's diary. Dreams of becoming a nurse, of helping patients at the local hospital. Her trembling voice made it feel as if Rachel were still there, smiling in the glow of the candlelight, her spirit lingering in memory if not in flesh. These rituals became the lifeline that tethered the Morgans to hope in a world that had grown increasingly indifferent. Some mornings, Patricia felt exhaustion pressing her down, tempting her to end the ritual, to stop lighting the porch lamp. But then she would see her daughter's face in memory, those bright eyes, that determined smile, and renew her silent vow. Rachel would never be abandoned, not by her. By then, Rachel's name had become a whisper around Daytona Beach, murmured, when locals passed Harbor Cafe or caught sight of a dark green pickup on the road. To newer residents, she was unknown, a ghost lost to history. But for the old-timers, her disappearance remained a scar, a reminder that anyone could vanish without a trace. From 2009 to 2019, Daytona Beach transformed. Glittering resorts rose along the coastline. High-rise hotels crowded the skyline. Motorcycle festivals drew roaring engines from across the nation, and once dark streets blazed with neon. The city flourished, but Rachel's story lay forgotten. In the sheriff's archives, her photo sealed in cold storage among hundreds of unresolved files, her smile fading into anonymity. For the Morgans, the city's prosperity only deepened their isolation. Michael, who had long been the family's quiet strength, carried the weight of grief like an anchor. He kept working at the auto shop, providing for his family, but friends noticed the toll. His shoulders stooped, his hair grayed faster than his years. Every time he drove past Harbor Cafe, his hands tightened on the wheel, jaw clenched against the flood of memory. But his eyes betrayed him, glassy with tears. In 2016, his heart finally gave out. An attack that came suddenly, silencing him forever. At his funeral, mourners whispered that Michael had died carrying the same burden he had lived with, the torment of unanswered questions. His death left Patricia alone to bear the vigil, while Ethan, now a young man, left for Gainesville to attend college, taking with him a silence as heavy as his mother's grief. He rarely spoke of Rachel, even to close friends, but on lonely nights in his dorm, he opened photos of the two of them laughing on the beach, shutting the laptop quickly before the memories swallowed him whole. Widowed but unyielding, Patricia pressed on with the annual memorials. Where once hundreds gathered, only a handful now remained. The circle of candles grew smaller each year, the voices fewer, but she persisted. Each September, she stood on the sand, letting flowers drift into the surf, whispering her daughter's name to the sea breeze that carried it away. To strangers passing by, it seemed a melancholy ritual, easily ignored as the city thrived around them. At the sheriff's office, young deputies glanced over Rachel's file without emotion, flipping past her photograph as just another cold case. The blurry ATM footage, the mud-stained jacket, none of it stirred their curiosity. Rachel had become a name in a database, a story stripped of urgency, a memory lost to time. But for Patricia, those 10 years were anything but silence. They were 10 years of waking each morning to the ache of absence, 10 years of reliving the same wound. She kept Rachel's room untouched, the sheet still carrying her perfume, the bulletin board still pinned with her unfinished class schedule. Some nights, she sat there for hours, talking to the shadows as if her daughter might somehow be listening. By the 14th year, even the most hopeful neighbors began to quietly accept there might never be an answer. Yet Patricia refused to let the silence bury her child. And in 2023, a spark finally appeared. Florida announced a new statewide program to fund cold case investigations, fueled by relentless families who demanded justice. For the first time in over a decade, next-generation DNA technology would be unleashed on evidence once dismissed as irrelevant. For Patricia, it was more than policy. It was the light of her porch, finally reflected back at her by the state itself, a chance, however small, that Rachel's voice might still be heard. Among the countless cold cases haunting Florida, Rachel Morgan's name was unexpectedly pulled from the shadows in 2023, chosen for review under the state's new funding program. For Patricia, the news felt like lightning splitting the dark sky. After 14 years of silence, the Volusia County Sheriff's Office informed her that the jacket found near Cypress Creek in 2009 would finally be reanalyzed. It was the very piece of evidence she had begged them to test again and again, only to be told it wasn't a priority. Now, technology had caught up with her persistence. When the evidence bag was unsealed, the fabric was damp, mold-streaked, and heavy with dried mud, but the truth it carried had not decayed. Advanced DNA sequencing identified Rachel's genetic trace, as expected, but also something more chilling. A male DNA profile, clear and intact, ready to be compared against the federal CODIS database. When the results came back, the lab fell into stunned silence. The profile matched Brian Holloway, 45 years old, an electrician who, in 2009, had lived only blocks from the Harbor Cafe. His name was not new to police. As a young man, he had arrests for assault and disorderly conduct, a history of domestic violence, and a suspended sentence from a bar fight. Yet after 2010, he seemed to vanish from trouble, leaving Daytona and slipping into obscurity. Now, his past and Rachel's fate collided in a revelation that cracked the case open like a long-sealed vault. Florida's Cold Case Unit immediately partnered with Volusia County investigators, tracing Brian to St. Augustine, just an hour north of Daytona. Neighbors described him as quiet, withdrawn, polite in passing but never close. A solitary man in a weathered mobile home, working at a small electrical company with no hint of the darkness that might follow him. For Patricia, the news was devastating and vindicating all at once. She remembered every tearful visit to the sheriff's office in those early years, begging them to test the jacket. If they had, maybe Michael would not have died under the crushing weight of uncertainty. Relief mixed with fury as police confirmed Brian Holloway was now the prime focus of the case. Investigators returned to old leads with new urgency. Former neighbors recalled Brian's drunken behavior at Harbor Cafe, his reputation for aggression, and most damning of all, his old dark green pickup, the same vehicle witnesses described circling near Rachel on the night she vanished. A mechanic even remembered repairing that truck in the same week Rachel disappeared. What had once been dismissed as fragmented anecdotes now, paired with DNA, formed a chillingly consistent picture. Florida media swarmed the story. The Orlando Sentinel declared in bold print, 2009 cold case cracked by DNA. Rachel Morgan may have been murdered. Local television ran endless reels of Rachel's smiling face, her youth and innocence juxtaposed against the mugshot of a man long forgotten. Daytona Beach found itself drowning in memory. The old wound ripped open, the ache of an entire community reborn. For Patricia, the breakthrough was a double-edged sword. She finally held proof that her daughter had not been forgotten, that answers were within reach, but every new detail clawed at her heart. She thought of Michael, sitting wordless on the porch night after night beneath the glow of the lamp, carrying his sorrow in silence. Would he have raged at the wasted years, or wept, in gratitude at the truth finally emerging? Patricia could not know. All she felt was the storm inside her, desperate for answers, terrified of what those answers might reveal. At the Cold Case Unit's headquarters, investigators covered their walls with 2009 maps of Daytona Beach, photos of Harbor Cafe, the ATM footage and witness statements, all drawn back into the light. At the center, written in bold across every chart, was one name: Brian Holloway. To detectives, he was no longer just a name from an old file. He was the shadow stepping forward from the past, and for the first time in 14 years, they had a chance to chase it down. This time there were no excuses, no limits of technology, and no patience left for silence. Standing before the cameras, the lead investigator spoke words that reverberated across Florida. We believe Rachel Morgan was the victim of a crime. We have DNA. We have witnesses. And we have the drive to keep going. This is no longer just a missing person case. For Patricia, those words felt like a door finally cracking open, allowing light to seep into a darkness that had lasted 14 years. Within days of the announcement, the Cold Case Unit's phone lines erupted. People who had been questioned back in 2009 now called voluntarily, their voices trembling with memories they had once dismissed. Each call carried the same name, Brian Holloway. Some admitted regret for staying silent, others shock that the man they once saw as harmless was now tied to Rachel's disappearance. One of the most striking testimonies came from Alice Campbell, a bar server who remembered September 14, 2009, with unsettling clarity. That night she had walked past a dark green pickup idling near the intersection across from Harbor Cafe. Behind the wheel sat Brian, his expression grim, his stare fixed on the cafe doors. The sight chilled her, but uncertain of its importance, she had said nothing at the time. Now, years later, the memory replayed in her mind, like a reel of old film, pushing her forward to finally testify. Another voice emerged, Ray Henderson, Brian's former neighbor. He recalled that same truck parked outside Brian's home late at night, sometimes laden with electrical gear, other times hidden beneath a tarp. To him, it had once seemed like nothing more than the habit of a solitary tradesman. But in hindsight, he sighed, we let too many details slip by. The puzzle pieces began to align. Brian was present near Harbor Cafe the night Rachel disappeared. He owned the exact vehicle witnesses described. He carried a history of violence that now seemed less like coincidence and more like a grim pattern. Daytona's community reacted, with shock that bordered on betrayal. The Daytona Beach News Journal published a front-page story. DNA points to Brian Holloway, prime suspect in Rachel Morgan case. Alongside the headline ran a photo of Brian from 2007, disheveled and bloodshot from a bar fight, his face hardened with aggression. Residents shuddered, remembering the electrician who once fixed bar wiring, church lights, or smiled politely in grocery store aisles. To think that man could be linked to their town's darkest tragedy rattled every sense of safety. On street corners, in diners, and during Sunday sermons, one name dominated every conversation. I let him into my house, one woman confessed, through tears in a televised interview. If he could do that to Rachel, what else could he do? Daytona was no sprawling metropolis. It was a community where most people knew each other by face, if not by name, and now they felt deceived, haunted by the idea that evil had lived among them unnoticed. For Patricia, the revelation nearly broke her. Sitting on her porch swing beneath the ever-burning light, she clutched the newspaper with Brian's photograph, her hands trembling. Her mind replayed those first frantic days when she had begged neighbors and strangers alike for clues, never once suspecting that Brian himself might have mingled among the searchers, hiding in plain sight. The thought suffocated her, pressing down like a physical weight. At Harbor Cafe, Rachel's last workplace, the owner posted a warning under Rachel's smiling photo. If you saw him here, contact police. Patrons whispered, glanced at the image, and shook their heads, some recalling Brian's presence but never imagining he was part of the story. Now, his name became a chilling specter, slipping into every household, every nightmare. For investigators, the flood of community memories was both gift and burden. Each account added to the tapestry of suspicion, but memories were imperfect, and time blurred truth with rumor. The challenge now was to filter carefully, to separate the fragments of reality from the haze of fear, because for the first time in over a decade, the case of Rachel Morgan was moving forward, and they could not afford to let the truth slip away again. Brian Holloway's name was no longer hidden in dusty files. It was the centerpiece of a story that had finally roared back to life. The community of Daytona Beach, once lulled into uneasy silence, now demanded a single answer. What did you do to Rachel Morgan? His reappearance in headlines struck the city like a tidal wave, washing away any illusion of innocence. Suddenly, Daytona itself became a crime scene. Every memory, every rumor from that September night in 2009 dragged back into the light. Yet the cold case unit knew witness accounts alone could not close the circle. To find the truth, they had to return to the terrain that had concealed Rachel's fate for 14 years. The Halifax River, winding only minutes from the Harbor Cafe, had long been suspected as a possible dumping ground. Back in 2009, police had skimmed its surface with outdated sonar, unable to cut through decades of silt and mud. But in 2023, technology gave them a second chance. On a gray March morning, investigators launched sleek boats equipped with three-dimensional sonar, supported by expert divers ready to brave the cold current. They scanned the riverbed methodically, their eyes fixed on the screens, until one image stopped them cold. A distorted outline buried in the mud, its shape unmistakably that of a car. Divers plunged into the murky depths, their beams slicing through darkness. Moments later, the truth emerged. A small silver sedan, corroded but recognizable as Michael Morgan's Toyota Corolla. The very car Rachel had driven the night she vanished. After 14 years, it had been there all along, resting silently beneath the waters of Daytona. The discovery spread faster than the tide itself. When Patricia received the news, she dropped to her knees. For years she had imagined the car, abandoned in some junkyard, stripped for parts, or vanished altogether. To know it had been lying in her hometown river was both confirmation and heartbreak. She whispered through tears, "It's real. It's really her car." Crowds gathered on the Halifax banks as cranes lifted the rusted frame into the air, its dripping silhouette suspended like a ghost of the past. Reporters shouted, cameras clicked, and neighbors wept openly as the Corolla, Rachel's final carriage home, returned to daylight. Police quickly covered the scene. But when forensic experts opened the door, what lay inside silenced even the most hardened investigators. Human bones, fragile yet distinct, rested across the back seat. Nylon rope remained twisted around a skeletal arm, undeniable evidence that Rachel had been bound before her car was sunk. The mud and algae that coated the interior had preserved her final story in chilling detail. Among the wreckage, personal relics surfaced like whispers from another life. A bracelet Patricia had given Rachel on her 18th birthday, tarnished but still recognizable. A waterlogged notebook, its ink smeared but its pages intact. A broken cell phone, long dead but once her lifeline. Forensic teams worked tirelessly, cataloging every fragment, every fiber, every shard of evidence. Within weeks, DNA results confirmed what Patricia already knew in her heart. The remains belonged to Rachel Morgan. The call came on a rainy afternoon. Patricia sat in her daughter's untouched bedroom, surrounded by posters and the scent of old perfume, when the officer's voice cracked through the phone. "We found Rachel. DNA confirmed." Patricia collapsed onto the desk, clutching Rachel's framed photo, whispering through sobs, "You're home now." The revelation shook Florida. Television stations replayed the haunting footage of the Corolla rising from the water, calling it Daytona's most shocking breakthrough in decades. The community reeled, heartbroken at Rachel's fate, enraged that for 14 years her car had lain just beneath their river, undetected. For investigators, the case had transformed overnight. No longer a disappearance, it was now a murder. With the rope, Brian Holloway's DNA on the jacket, his violent history, and his ownership of the green pickup, the chain of evidence began to lock into place. Piece by piece, the shadow of a crime once buried in silence was finally being assembled into the shape of truth. Rachel's final moments, once clouded in rumor, had now taken horrifying shape. Ambushed after her shift, restrained, driven away, and her Corolla deliberately sunk in the Halifax River to erase every trace. The name Brian Holloway loomed larger than ever, no longer a whisper in dusty files but the figure at the center of Daytona's outrage. The community, shaken by the recovery of Rachel's car and remains, reignited her memory. Vigils bloomed on the riverbank where the Corolla was found. Dozens leaving flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. "Rachel, we finally brought you out of the dark." At the Morgan home, the porch light that had burned for 14 years stayed on, not as a symbol of waiting, but as a beacon of remembrance for a daughter whose soul now had a voice. The discovery shifted the entire tone of the investigation. The Volusia County Sheriff's Office no longer spoke of disappearance. This was murder. On the cold case unit's table, photos of the mud-stained jacket, the nylon rope pulled from the Corolla, and Brian Holloway's file formed a chilling mosaic. Investigators dug deeper than ever before, pulling in federal forensic support to re-examine the data overlooked in 2009. For the first time, they recovered detailed cell phone records from the night Rachel vanished. The results stripped away every shadow of doubt. The logs showed Brian's phone pinging off a tower less than 1,000 feet from the Harbor Cafe between 10:15 and 10:30 that September night, matching the exact window of Rachel's last phone call to her mother and the ATM footage of headlights passing by. By 11, the records traced his phone along the Halifax River, before briefly dropping out of service precisely where the Corolla had been found. It was not speculation anymore. It was cold, unshakable electronic evidence, aligning perfectly with the DNA on the jacket, witness sightings of his green pickup, and the rope inside the car. The picture of guilt was complete. In the briefing room, seasoned detectives sat in heavy silence, their anger unspoken but palpable. They remembered 2009, when Brian had been casually questioned over a bar dispute and then let go. Never linked to Rachel because the evidence had seemed too thin. Now, with hindsight, that decision cut deep. They knew if the jacket had been tested, if the phone records had been checked, Rachel might have been found, and Michael Morgan might still be alive. The regret weighed as heavily as the fury. When the news of the phone data hit the press, Daytona Beach erupted. Residents felt betrayed all over again. "How did we let a monster live free for 14 years?" read one viral post. Online forums that had once grown quiet now swelled with outrage. Citizens recalling encounters with Brian fixing their lights or sipping coffee in local diners, horrified to realize a suspected killer had lived quietly in their midst. The community's sense of safety fractured, replaced by collective fury. For Patricia, the confirmation was both a verdict and a dagger. Holding Rachel's rusted bracelet, the one recovered from the car, she listened as police laid out the evidence. The DNA, the rope, the phone data. Each fact was like a hammer blow, but also undeniable proof that the truth had finally surfaced. She thought of Michael, who had gone to his grave without answers, and whispered through tears, "Michael, we finally found him." On the investigator's desk, a draft arrest warrant lay ready for the prosecutor's signature. The charges were severe: first-degree murder, kidnapping, unlawful restraint. The case was now airtight, but investigators knew the stakes were higher than ever. One mistake could unravel everything in court. They had to be meticulous, but also decisive. The net around Brian Holloway had tightened, and there was no escape. In the days before the operation, officers watched Brian's every move from unmarked cars outside his St. Augustine mobile home. He still lived as if nothing had changed, repairing wiring, buying groceries, picking up beer at the corner store. To neighbors, he seemed like an ordinary middle-aged man. But behind closed doors, his solitude was stark. No family, no friends, just a guarded figure locking his doors tightly. Detectives suspected he felt the pressure, aware of unseen eyes watching. What he didn't know was that his time had finally run out. Perhaps Brian Holloway had always lived in the shadows, hiding his darkness beneath a mask of normalcy. But now the mask was torn away. At a press conference, the Volusia County prosecutor declared they had undeniable physical evidence against him. No details were released, but everyone knew the Rachel Morgan case had reached a point of no return. Even defense attorneys, normally quick to challenge, admitted that with DNA, phone data, and witness accounts, Brian's chances of acquittal were slim to none. September 12, 2023, was chosen as the day of action. A task force of 10 officers prepared to surround Brian's St. Augustine mobile home. They mapped every angle, planned to cut the power, and rehearsed how to subdue him should he resist. After 14 long years, the arrest warrant was finally signed. The night before, Patricia sat on her porch, her gaze fixed on the lamp she had never once turned off. She whispered into the quiet, "Rachel, look. Justice is coming." Daytona Beach held its collective breath, the air thick with anticipation. At dawn on October 18th, under a gray sky that seemed to foreshadow a storm, officers moved in. At 6:15 in the morning, they surrounded the mobile home tucked at the end of a dirt road. When the loudspeaker ordered him out, Brian shuffled into view, his face unshaven, his eyes tired. He didn't fight. He only looked around with a resigned expression, as though he had been expecting this day all along. Cold steel cuffs snapped shut on his wrists, and with flashing lights filling the street, his 14 years of freedom ended. Within hours, the images blanketed Florida's news, and soon the nation's. Cameras captured Brian being led from his home in a crumpled shirt, head bowed. But the real gut punch came when residents remembered that back in 2009, Brian had joined volunteer search groups. He had walked alongside neighbors combing fields, even patted Michael Morgan on the shoulder, murmuring, "Don't worry, we'll find her." What once seemed like kindness now revealed itself as a grotesque charade. The realization cut through Daytona like a knife. At Harbor Cafe, Rachel's last workplace, people gathered, whispering in disbelief. A woman wept into a reporter's microphone. "We let him into our lives." He looked Rachel's mother in the eye and pretended to comfort her. All the while, he was the one who took her. The betrayal shattered what little innocence the town still held. At home, Patricia sat trembling before the television, watching Brian's face in close-up. Her mind flashed back to the early days, remembering a stranger who had handed out sandwiches to search volunteers. She now understood it wasn't compassion. It was cover. She clutched Rachel's framed photo, tears streaming down her cheeks. But this time her grief was mixed with fire. Justice had finally stepped across her porch. That afternoon, police announced formal charges: first-degree murder, and kidnapping. They emphasized the case was built on undeniable evidence: DNA, phone records, physical proof. The news erupted across Florida, sparking vigils outside Harbor Cafe. Flowers and candles piling up in honor of the young woman who had waited 14 years for her voice to be heard. On social media, outrage surged. The murderer lived among us for 14 years. Rachel finally has a voice. October 18, 2023, became a date etched into Daytona Beach's memory. The day justice advanced, and the day the community was forced to confront the chilling truth. That the neighbor they trusted, the man they shook hands with, was a predator behind a mask of normalcy. When Brian Holloway was led away in cuffs, Daytona Beach was no longer the same. Less than a month later, the prosecutor's office confirmed what the community had been waiting to hear. Brian would face a public trial. On the first day, the courthouse overflowed with people. Reporters crammed the halls, and for the first time in 14 years, Rachel Morgan's name was spoken not in whispers of mystery, but in the clear, commanding voice of a murder indictment. Cameras followed Patricia Morgan as she entered the courthouse, clutching her daughter's photo like a shield. Under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights, the jury sat stiff and unsmiling, their eyes fixed on Brian Holloway. In his orange jumpsuit, hair cropped close, he appeared smaller than the monster painted in headlines. But his cold, detached stare betrayed no remorse. When the prosecutor rose, the tone shifted. Piece by piece, he laid out the evidence that had been buried for 14 years. First came the DNA report, a perfect match between Brian and the male sample found on the jacket near Cypress Creek. Then images of the Corolla, dredged from the Halifax River, its back seat littered with bones, nylon rope still coiled around the remains of Rachel's arm. Finally, the phone records, maps glowing on the screen, tracing Brian's movements, from Harbor Cafe to the very stretch of river where the car was found. "Ladies and gentlemen," the prosecutor declared, his voice steady, "this is no longer a mystery. This is murder. And that man, Brian Holloway, is the one who did it." Silence swallowed the courtroom. Patricia sat in the front row, her vision blurring as her daughter's smiling face filled the screen. For 14 years she had dreamed of this day. But reality struck harder than she could have imagined. Beside her, Ethan, now a grown man, gripped her hand, steadying her through every detail that cut into their hearts. The defense tried to unravel the case. They argued the DNA might have been left on the jacket by chance, that Brian merely lived nearby, and that the phone data only proved he was in the area, not that he killed Rachel. But each point collapsed under the weight of the evidence. When witnesses took the stand, the final cracks appeared. Alice Campbell trembled as she described Brian's grim stare from his pickup truck that night. Ray Henderson recalled seeing that green truck, sometimes hidden under a tarp, sitting outside Brian's home for months. Their testimonies, combined with the forensic trail, painted a picture the jury could not ignore. Brian sat motionless, his expression empty, his silence no longer strength but a hollow mask of a man cornered. Outside, Daytona watched the trial unfold on live television, conversations buzzing in diners, barbershops, and churches. Rage mingled with relief. The truth was finally being spoken aloud. On verdict day, the courtroom was so crowded that even the sound of a clerk's pencil tapping echoed like thunder. After less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. "We find the defendant, Brian Holloway, guilty of first-degree murder." The words rang through the chamber. Cries and sobs broke out. Patricia buried her face in her hands, tears of anguish and release pouring down. Ethan squeezed her shoulder, whispering, "We did it. Rachel's been heard." The judge's gavel fell with finality, life without parole. Brian was led away, head bowed, offering no apology, no explanation. The cameras captured his last walk as a free man, a once smiling neighbor, now etched in history as a symbol of betrayal. Outside, dozens gathered with signs bearing Rachel's photo, chanting, "Justice for Rachel." They embraced the Morgans, some elderly residents admitting it, felt like a 14-year wait had finally lifted. National media seized the story, calling it one of Florida's most important cold case resolutions of the decade. Patricia, gaunt but unbroken, stood before Reporters, clutching a small paper. Her voice cracked, yet it carried. I waited 14 years to hear guilty. 14 years of darkness, of rumors that scarred me, of nights with the porch light burning for my daughter. Today, justice finally spoke Rachel's name. Officers bowed their heads, some haunted by the thought that swifter action in 2009 might have spared years of torment. That night, Daytona Beach held its largest memorial yet. On the sand where Rachel once jogged at sunrise, hundreds of candles formed the shape of a glowing heart around her photograph, her smile radiant against the night. White carnations lined the shoreline, waves lapping gently as if carrying her memory outward. Her old classmates read from her diary, sharing dreams of becoming a nurse, of helping others. And though Rachel Morgan was gone, the city finally spoke. Her name not in whispers of mystery, but in a chorus of remembrance, justice, and love. The waves rolled against the shore, blending with whispered prayers until the beach itself seemed to sing a mournful hymn. When Rachel's name was spoken, the crowd answered as one, a vow that she would never be forgotten. That night was more than a vigil. It was a declaration. The ignored jacket, left untouched for 14 years, had become the golden key to justice. Media outlets called it DNA's triumph over darkness. And across Florida, families of the missing clung to hope that science might breathe life into their silent cases. Patricia stood in the circle of candles, her face lit by their glow, her voice breaking as she looked skyward and said, "I wish Michael were here to see this day. He waited. He hurt. He walked this hopeless journey with me. But I believe, somewhere, he heard the guilty verdict." The crowd fell still, only the sound of waves and sobs filling the night. The image of a widowed mother clutching her daughter's photo in candlelight became etched in the community's memory. Rachel's story rippled outward. Local schools wove her case into lessons about safety, justice, and perseverance. Teachers explained how persistence and science brought answers, urging students to value small details and to look out for one another. Parents, shaken by the story, warned their children about late-night walks, but also reassured them that society had stronger tools now to guard the truth. Police academies and forensic conferences studied Rachel's case as a landmark, proof that no piece of evidence was too trivial. The jacket dismissed in 2009 became the model for why cold cases must always be revisited with fresh eyes. Yet for Patricia, the pain could never be filed away as precedent. After the memorial, she returned to her home and stood beneath the porch light she had kept burning all those years. For the first time, it was no longer a signal of hope, but a flame of remembrance. She set Rachel's photo on the table, her whisper carried by the night air. "You have justice now, Rachel. You can rest." Daytona Beach was washed in tears and candlelight, its grief transformed into a beacon. Rachel Morgan's story no longer belonged only to her family. It had become a lesson to an entire community, proof that truth can resurface even after decades when held up by faith, science, and love. The aftershocks spread quickly. Neighbors on porches confessed to reporters how Brian had been inside their homes, fixing outlets or replacing lights. Ann Roberts, who lived just 3 doors down, shuddered as she recalled offering him tea. "I let a killer walk into my home like he was family." Her story was echoed by dozens more. In diners, barbershops, and Sunday pews, conversations revolved around the betrayal. The good guy neighbor who had fixed wiring, smiled at checkout lines, and even prayed beside them had all along been hiding a darker self. Younger residents admitted unease. If Brian could hide behind such a mask, who else might be living a double life in their small city? Daytona Beach, once synonymous with racing, neon lights, and sunny beaches, now carried a permanent shadow. Reporters dug into Brian's past, speaking with old coworkers who described a man who could snap over the smallest things, classmates who recalled his temper, neighbors who remembered nights of loud arguments. Piece by piece, a violent man emerged from behind the polite nods and neighborly gestures. The betrayal spread beyond Daytona, echoing across Florida. Rachel's case became a rallying cry. Advocacy groups launched the DNA for All campaign, pushing lawmakers to require that every piece of evidence in cold cases be retested with modern methods. Her name was invoked at every meeting. If the 2009 jacket had been tested then, speakers argued, the Morgans would not have carried 14 years of pain. Under growing pressure, Florida legislators began drafting new laws to guarantee annual budgets for cold case DNA testing. In televised hearings at the state capitol, Patricia sat in the front row, her daughter's photo pressed to her chest, a silent but unshakable witness that justice delayed must never again be justice denied. She never had to say a word. Patricia's presence alone, her weary eyes, the lines of grief etched deep into her face, spoke volumes in that legislative chamber. One lawmaker summed it up best. Rachel Morgan is gone, but her legacy is hope for hundreds of other families. In Daytona, the community refused to let her memory fade. Vigils continued, but so did rebuilding. A nursing scholarship was founded in Rachel's name, granting young students the chance to pursue the dream she never lived to fulfill. Each award carried her story forward, reminding everyone that hope can still grow from tragedy. Yet unease lingered. Neighbors admitted they now looked at each other differently, suspicion gnawing where trust once stood. "I thought Daytona was safe," one woman confessed. "But this case showed we never truly know who lives beside us." That unease remained like an aftershock for months, but in time, it strengthened the community's resolve. They learned that no detail is too small to investigate, no case too old to revisit, and no family too forgotten to fight for. Rachel Morgan became more than a victim of one city. Her story became a symbol for Florida and the nation. In her name, people remembered the importance of persistence, the necessity of science, and the duty of community responsibility. The jacket, ignored for 14 years, became the emblem of why no piece of evidence should ever be dismissed. Rachel's story proved that investing in forensic science does more than solve mysteries of the past. It safeguards the future. And Brian Holloway's betrayal, the trusted electrician who once handed out sandwiches at search parties while concealing his guilt, reminded America of an unsettling truth. Appearances can deceive, and vigilance is essential. Victim advocacy. Groups used Rachel's case to push for sweeping reforms, demanding DNA retesting in every cold case across the state. Her story was not just mourned, it reshaped policy, offering the chance to prevent others from enduring her family's pain. Today, when a cold case reemerges on the evening news, Rachel Morgan's name stands as a lesson. Never lose hope. Justice may come late, but with family persistence, community solidarity, and the steady progress of science, truth will always find a way back to the light.
Thank you for joining us in Rachel Morgan's 14-year journey to justice. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel as we continue exploring cold cases where silence waits to be broken, and truth still yearns for its light. See you in the next story. Rachel Morgan's story is more than a tragedy, it's a reminder that truth can hide for years, but with love, persistence, and science, justice can still prevail. A porch light that once burned in hope now shines in remembrance, carrying her name into the future. Her case has changed Florida forever, proving no cold case should ever be forgotten. If Rachel's story moved you, share this video to keep her memory alive, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, because, together, we'll continue bringing light to the stories that deserve to be told.